November 27, 1941, Portland, Oregon. A crisp winter morning hung over the Willamette River as a crowd gathered on the docks, eyes fixed on a hulking, angular silhouette waiting to meet the water. Smoke curled from the shipyard chimneys, blending with the fog rolling off the river, and a sense of anticipation buzzed through the air. But amid the murmurs of awe there was something else, a quiet, almost cruel laughter. The ship wasn't graceful. Its lines were boxy, its hull awkward, its appearance crude compared to the sleek, polished vessels naval architects typically boasted about. Journalists jotted notes with raised eyebrows, their pens dripping skepticism onto paper. "A floating eyesore," one editor muttered. "It looks cheap, like it won't last a crossing to San Francisco, let alone across the Atlantic." Engineers shook their heads, whispering about weak welds and questionable design. Some even called it a death trap for the sailors who would have to rely on it. And yet, here it was, the SS Patrick Henry, the first of the Liberty ships, ready to launch. America was on the brink. Supplies to Britain, France, and other Allied nations were slipping through the cracks. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking convoys faster than they could be replaced. Every cargo ship lost was a lifeline severed, a ration of food, a shipment of ammunition, a crate of medical supplies denied to those who needed it most. Desperation was mounting, and the Allies needed a solution, fast. Enter Henry Kaiser. A man of relentless energy and vision, known for transforming construction and industry with his innovations, Kaiser wasn't intimidated by criticism. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. He promised the impossible, a fleet of cargo ships built at record speed, each one capable of crossing oceans and delivering the supplies the world was counting on. His methods were unorthodox, modular, and revolutionary. Critics scoffed, calling him reckless, but he pressed on with a stubborn intensity that few could match. As the Patrick Henry slipped into the water, the river seemed to hold its breath. Spectators leaned forward, bracing for failure. Would it sink immediately? Would it break apart under its own weight? Or would it somehow survive, defying all expectations? This was more than a launch. It was a moment poised between doubt and possibility, ridicule and triumph. The ugly duckling of the American shipyards, dismissed as an eyesore and a gamble, was about to embark on a journey that would test the ingenuity of its creators and the courage of its crew. And though few on the docks could foresee it, this awkward, hastily built ship would become a linchpin in a war that demanded speed, endurance, and relentless determination. It would quietly prove that sometimes the most unassuming beginnings hold the power to change history. The river swallowed the Patrick Henry, its bow cutting through the cold waters, and for a brief moment, the critics' laughter was swallowed by the uncertainty of what might come next. The story of the Liberty ships, the ugly ducklings that would save the Allies, was only just beginning. The Atlantic was a graveyard. Convoys vanished beneath the relentless torpedoes of German U-boats, their deadly wake stretching from the icy waters of Greenland to the storm-lashed coasts of Britain. Every ship sunk was a disaster measured in tons of supplies, in lives lost, in hope slipping through the fingers of Allied forces. Britain's ports groaned under the strain, ration lines lengthened, and the cries of soldiers and civilians echoed the urgency of a world at war. Time was the enemy, and the Allies were losing. In the midst of this crisis, Henry Kaiser looked at a problem that seemed insurmountable. Traditional shipbuilding was slow, meticulous, almost ceremonial, a method ill-suited for a world desperate for speed. Ships were crafted piece by piece, keel by keel, taking months, sometimes over a year, to complete. Every weld was examined, every timber measured, every curve perfected. In ordinary times, this method produced masterpieces of naval engineering. But these were not ordinary times. Lives depended on volume and velocity, on replacing what the U-boats had destroyed faster than the enemy could sink it. Kaiser saw a different path. He envisioned a shipyard as a giant machine where innovation replaced tradition and speed did not mean sacrifice. Modular construction became the cornerstone of his method. Sections of hulls, prefabricated in workshops miles from the dock, were transported and assembled like massive jigsaw pieces. Welding replaced riveting, cutting production time in half. Every worker had a specialized role, every movement optimized for efficiency. Kaiser's approach was mechanical, almost surgical. Yet it carried the pulse of human urgency. The Navy brass, however, was unconvinced. Engineers whispered behind closed doors about the dangers of prefabrication, structural weaknesses, brittle welds, sections coming apart at sea. Critics argued that the Liberty ship was a gamble, a floating experiment that could shatter the lives of the men tasked with sailing it. Skepticism ran deep, punctuated by grim predictions of hulls buckling under stress, engines failing mid-ocean, or the first convoy being lost to disaster. Yet Kaiser moved forward with relentless determination. He personally oversaw the workflow, inspecting welds, coordinating teams, and pushing machinery to its limits. Workers, initially doubtful, began to internalize the urgency. They became part of something larger than themselves, a human assembly line charged with saving a continent. The shipyard buzzed with energy, a symphony of hammers, welding torches, and shouted instructions. It was chaos organized with precision, a system that could churn out ships at a pace the world had never seen. Traditional shipbuilders looked on with incredulity. In yards where a single cargo vessel might take nearly a year, Kaiser was shaving months off the schedule. A Liberty ship could be completed in weeks, the first in record time, an accomplishment that seemed impossible to anyone steeped in conventional practices. And yet the riverbanks were lined with hulking hulls taking shape faster than skeptics could digest. It was a spectacle of efficiency, almost surreal, where once there were drawings and plans. Now there were ships, tangible, floating proofs of innovation. Still, doubts lingered. Would the welds hold in the storm-tossed Atlantic? Could engines built in rapid succession endure a transoceanic journey? Critics muttered, engineers fretted, and Navy officers crossed their fingers. The tension in the shipyard was palpable, every worker aware that history was being written on an accelerated timetable. The world was watching, and failure was not an option. Finally, after weeks of feverish work, the first Liberty ship born of skepticism, doubt, and urgency was complete. Its hull gleamed under the gray skies of Portland, a testament to human ingenuity and industrial audacity. Workers stepped back, exhausted but exhilarated, their pride mingling with anxiety. Across the river, naval inspectors and journalists approached, some with admiration, others with disbelief. The question hung heavy in the air. Could this hastily assembled vessel survive the harshest seas and the deadliest enemies the world had ever seen? The SS Patrick Henry was ready for its maiden voyage, a floating challenge to every critic, engineer, and skeptic who had doubted its worth. As the tide rose beneath its hull, the river seemed to hold its breath, echoing the uncertainty of a war-torn world. The moment of truth was at hand, and the eyes of a desperate nation were fixed on an ugly duckling that had the potential to become a hero for Henry Kaiser. For the workers who had poured their sweat into its construction, and for the Allies counting every ton of cargo. The question remained, would this revolutionary approach withstand the trials of the Atlantic or crumble under the weight of doubt? The Atlantic was a restless, unforgiving expanse, stretching gray and endless under storm-darkened skies. November winds whipped across the deck of the SS Patrick Henry as it slid into the open ocean. The first of the Liberty ships leaving Portland behind, laden with war supplies destined for Britain. The crew, a mix of seasoned sailors and green recruits, stood tense, gripping railings as waves crashed against the hull. Every creak and groan of the ship reminded them of the skeptics' warnings. The welds were weak, the engines untested, the ship cheap and ugly. From the outset, the voyage was a test not just of engineering but of endurance. Storms hit with sudden fury. Torrential rain lashed the deck, wind tore at the sails of nearby support vessels, and freezing spray stung the sailors' faces. The Patrick Henry shuddered as waves collided with its bow, the hull twisting under the relentless pressure. Some sailors muttered prayers, others cursed the skeptics who had predicted disaster long before the ship ever saw the sea. But every shudder, every creak, became a measure of resilience, a test of whether the unproven design could survive the unforgiving Atlantic. Mechanical troubles compounded the tension. The main engine rattled and coughed, alarms sounded from the boilers, and the crew raced to diagnose each problem under the howling wind. Men slid across wet decks, their hands raw and blistered, improvising repairs on the fly. Every failure seemed to validate the critics' warnings, every minor leak a potential death sentence in the stormy expanse. And yet the crew endured, guided by instinct, determination, and a flickering faith in the ship beneath their feet. Adding to the peril was the invisible threat of German U-boats. Convoys were constantly shadowed by the lurking submarines, torpedoes capable of turning a ship into splintered wreckage in seconds. Lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, hearts pounding at every suspicious wake. The threat was constant, unseen, but omnipresent, a reminder that even if the ship survived nature's fury, enemy fire could finish what the storm began amid the chaos. Moments of human bravery and ingenuity shone through. Sailors rigged emergency pumps when hull seams flexed dangerously. Engineers crawled into engine compartments, soot and oil covering their faces to keep the ship moving. The radio operator, drenched and shivering, sent out updates to convoy command, guiding the ship through treacherous waters and alerting nearby vessels to unseen threats. The ship became a microcosm of courage, resourcefulness, and relentless human will, its crew bound together by the shared knowledge that lives depended on their success. Yet, for all the heroism, disaster seemed poised to strike. During a violent storm, a sudden wave slammed into the starboard side, causing a seam in the hull to bend dangerously. Water poured into the cargo hold, threatening to destabilize the vessel. The crew fought to secure pumps, manning them with grim determination, sweat mixing with rain as they labored to keep the ship afloat. In that moment, critics' predictions appeared terrifyingly accurate. The Liberty ship, they feared, might fail spectacularly, drowning its cargo and perhaps its crew beneath the Atlantic waves, but somehow, against odds that seemed insurmountable, the Patrick Henry endured. The hull held, the engines roared back to life, and the storm finally relented, leaving a battered but unbroken ship slicing through the dark waters. The crew, exhausted and soaked to the bone, stared at the horizon, knowing that the journey was far from over. The Atlantic was merciless, and the U-boats were still out there, shadowing every convoy. As night fell and the wind howled against the deck, a tense silence settled over the Patrick Henry. For the first time, a flicker of confidence emerged. This crude, hastily assembled ship, the ugly duckling of the American shipyards, had survived its first real test. Yet the suspense remained, thick as the fog rolling over the waves. Could it endure the rest of the crossing? Could the Liberty ships truly withstand the Atlantic and deliver the supplies the Allies so desperately needed? The answer remained uncertain, the tension unbroken. As the Patrick Henry pressed onward into the stormy night, the lives of its crew and the hope of a nation riding on its improbable hull, the convoy cut through the North Atlantic like a line of determined ants. Each ship a lifeline bristling with supplies for a war that had already claimed millions of lives. Among them, the Liberty ships stood out not for beauty, but for sheer presence. Their boxy hulls and utilitarian design had once drawn scorn and ridicule, yet now, under the gray skies and rolling waves, they bore the weight of hope. For the Allies, every crate, every ton of food, ammunition, and medical supplies represented the difference between survival and defeat. This particular convoy, codenamed HX-229, had been targeted by German U-boats before departure. Intelligence reports predicted ambush along the route, and the sailors braced for a fight they knew would test every ounce of courage and ingenuity. The SS Patrick Henry led the way, cutting through choppy waters with a resolve that belied its crude appearance. On deck, sailors moved like trained dancers, securing cargo, adjusting sails, and manning anti-aircraft guns. Every hour in the freezing wind, every moment of strain, reinforced the ship's fragile reputation. Against the judgment of those who had once mocked it, observers from both the Navy and the press followed closely, their eyes sharp for evidence of failure. Reporters scribbled furiously, expecting the inevitable disaster that critics had long predicted. Engineers paced the decks, calculating stress points, muttering doubts about welds and engine tolerances. The Atlantic, a vast theater of chaos and danger, seemed poised to validate their fears. Then the enemy appeared. Shadows beneath the waves, torpedoes streaking silently toward the convoy, forced crews into split-second decisions. Alarm bells rang as sailors dived for action stations. The Liberty ships, despite their hastily assembled frames, responded with a precision that stunned even the skeptics. Damage control teams worked tirelessly to patch breaches, maintain stability, and keep engines running at peak output. Convoy coordination, honed under Kaiser's visionary production methods, allowed them to maneuver as a unit, mitigating losses while keeping supplies moving forward. Across the Atlantic, stories of human bravery began to unfold. On the SS John W. Brown, a Liberty ship not far behind the Patrick Henry, a crew member crawled into the engine room as flames licked the bulkhead, extinguishing fires with nothing but buckets and sheer determination. Soldiers on the receiving end of these shipments would later recount arriving at ports to find rations, ammunition, and medical equipment waiting just in time. Supplies that might otherwise have been lost to the merciless U-boats. Each crate saved a life. Each successful crossing reinforced the unspoken truth that the ugly ducklings were no longer merely ships, they were lifelines. By the time the convoy reached the safety of Britain's ports, relief and astonishment rippled through the observers. Navy brass, once vocal in their skepticism, exchanged reluctant glances, muttering phrases like, "I didn't think it could hold up." But it did. Journalists, some still holding their pens as if to correct themselves mid-sentence, filed reports that praised the speed, efficiency, and resilience of the Liberty ships. The ships were no longer curiosities. They had proven themselves under fire against nature and against the enemy. The human element was undeniable. Sailors returned to dock with eyes bright despite exhaustion, sharing stories of storms weathered, torpedoes dodged, and comrades saved. In pubs and town squares, civilians celebrated the arrival of supplies that meant food on the table, blankets on frozen floors, and medicines for the sick. For many, the Liberty ships became symbols not of crude construction, but of survival and ingenuity, a tangible proof that American industry could deliver when the world needed it most. Even the harshest critics began to relent, their grudging respect etched into every observation. The ugly duckling had transformed in the eyes of all who had doubted it. What had been a symbol of cheapness and risk had become a symbol of reliability, a cornerstone in the fight against tyranny. Kaiser's vision had not only materialized in steel and welding, it had been tested in storm, under fire, and across the treacherous Atlantic, emerging victorious as the convoy docked, unloading its precious cargo amidst cheers, laughter, and tears of relief. The Patrick Henry and its sister ships stood silently proud. They were no longer mocked. They had earned their place in history. The skeptics' warnings faded into memory, replaced by admiration, gratitude, and awe. The Liberty ships had proven their worth not through elegance, but through endurance, courage, and an unyielding ability to deliver hope across the most dangerous waters the world had ever known. And though the war was far from over, for the first time, the Allies could believe that these ugly ducklings might just turn the tide. The air above the shipyards hummed with relentless energy, a constant roar of machinery, hammers, and welding torches. From Portland to Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser's vision had transformed the American coastline into a sprawling industrial battlefield. Every yard was alive with purpose, every worker moving with precision, and yet beneath the organized chaos lay a tension that refused to fade. The war raged on, and every ship mattered. Every day wasted could tip the balance in the Atlantic, where German U-boats prowled like predators waiting for the slightest mistake. By 1943, the Liberty ships had moved beyond the realm of novelty and skepticism. In Kaiser's yards, a ship now left the slipway every 4 days, a pace that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. The sight was dizzying, hundreds of hulls under construction, steel skeletons rising like giants from the water, cranes swinging massive prefabricated sections into place with mechanical precision. Each ship was a testament to human ingenuity, a floating promise that the Allies would never run short of supplies. The scale of the operation was staggering. Tens of thousands of workers labored tirelessly across multiple shipyards. Men, women, and teenagers, many with no prior experience in shipbuilding, became experts almost overnight. Women, in particular, stepped into roles traditionally reserved for men, operating welding machines, assembling hull sections, and coordinating logistics with a determination born of necessity. These new shipbuilders were more than laborers, they were warriors in overalls, fighting a war of production rather than bullets. But no less crucial to the outcome, Kaiser's modular assembly line approach had made such feats possible. Prefabricated sections, some weighing hundreds of tons, were produced in factories miles from the docks and transported to the shipyard for assembly. Teams specialized in welding, riveting, and engine installation, each movement choreographed to minimize downtime. Every second counted, and the yards operated with a rhythm that resembled both a military operation and a finely tuned orchestra. Efficiency was law, speed was king, and innovation was the lifeblood of the enterprise. Why? Yet despite these achievements, danger never receded. The U-boats continued to stalk the Atlantic, claiming ships and men with merciless efficiency. Each vessel that left the yard carried the weight of survival. And even as production accelerated, the stakes could not be ignored. Convoys were carefully coordinated, radio operators scanned for threats, and crews trained relentlessly for emergency scenarios. One miscalculation, one mechanical failure, and the cargo might never reach its destination. The specter of the Atlantic loomed over every launch, a reminder that production speed alone was not enough amid this relentless push. Whispers of the ship's role in the coming invasion of Normandy began to circulate. Military planners understood that without a reliable fleet capable of delivering men, weapons, and supplies across the English Channel, the D-Day landings would falter before they began. The Liberty ships, once derided for their crude design, had become a critical component of Allied strategy. Each vessel that left the shipyard was not just steel and engines, it was a lifeline. A guarantee that soldiers on distant shores would have the support they needed when the time came, inside the yards. Pride and anxiety mingled in equal measure. Workers paused only briefly to admire the fruits of their labor before returning to the assembly lines, knowing that the next hull was already waiting. Supervisors monitored progress, adjusting schedules and reallocating teams to meet production quotas. The pace was exhausting, but the outcome was undeniable. America was churning out ships faster than the enemy could destroy them. A relentless tide of steel and determination pressing toward victory. And yet the war was far from over. U-boat patrols remained a deadly threat, storms still roared across the Atlantic, and every convoy carried the weight of history on its decks. The Liberty ships had proven themselves in isolated voyages, but the true test supporting the largest amphibious invasion in history still lay ahead. Every weld, every rivet, every hour spent in the frigid yards, was preparation for a moment that would decide the fate of nations. By the end of 1943, the Liberty fleet had grown into a massive armada of hundreds of ships, each one a testament to innovation, courage, and unyielding human effort. The once mocked ugly ducklings had become the backbone of Allied logistics, and their influence stretched far beyond the docks. The war demanded speed, endurance, and resilience, and in Kaiser's shipyards, all three were being delivered in abundance. One ship at a time, the launch of the next Liberty ship, each faster and more efficient than the last, was a promise to the men and women on the front lines. The Allies would arrive prepared, and no U-boat, no storm, no obstacle could stop them. Yet the Atlantic remained a challenge, waiting patiently to test these floating marvels. The question that loomed over every launch was simple but terrifying. Would these ships, produced at unprecedented speed, be enough when the world's greatest battle finally arrived? The Liberty fleet stretched across the oceans like a chain of hope, each ship carrying the weight of nations on its steel back. Britain's ports, once plagued by shortages, now brimmed with supplies, tons of food, ammunition, medical equipment, and vehicles arriving with a regularity that stunned even the most seasoned military planners. In the icy waters of the Arctic convoys to Russia, Liberty ships battled not only the elements but the ever-present threat of German torpedoes. Their cargoes often the difference between survival and starvation for entire cities. Every crossing was a high-stakes gamble, and yet, these ships, once mocked for their crude construction, proved resilient beyond expectation. On one convoy bound for Liverpool, the SS Joseph N. Teal came under a night attack. Torpedoes streaked through the black waters, explosions rocking the hull. Panic gripped the sailors, yet training and preparation turned chaos into coordinated action. Pumps were manned, fires were extinguished, and the ship maintained course. Against all odds, the cargo arrived intact, and the troops awaiting supplies on the docks were able to move forward with operations that might otherwise have stalled. Moments like these became emblematic of the Liberty ship's unexpected reliability. Farther north, convoys supplying Lend-Lease aid to Russia faced brutal storms and ice-laden waters. Sailors huddled against freezing decks, battling winds that threatened to snap rigging and crush cargo. Yet again the ships endured. Tanks, rifles, and blankets reached Soviet ports just in time, keeping soldiers and civilians alive through harsh winters. The human cost of failure was unthinkable, and every successful crossing was celebrated as a victory against both nature and the enemy. The skeptics could no longer hide their astonishment. Naval engineers who had once derided the welds, the hulls, and the engines began to acknowledge the undeniable truth: the Liberty ships worked. They carried enormous loads, crossed oceans under fire, and delivered their precious cargo with a dependability that few thought possible. Newspaper headlines shifted from ridicule to grudging admiration. "Steel lifelines of democracy," one paper proclaimed. "Ugly ships that carry the weight of war." The transformation in perception was dramatic, a testament not only to Henry Kaiser's vision but to the courage and ingenuity of the crews who braved storm and torpedo alike. Stories of individual bravery and critical delivery spread quickly. On the docks of England, soldiers marveled at the sight of trucks, artillery, and supplies being unloaded from vessels that had weathered storms and enemy attacks. In hospitals, doctors relied on medical shipments brought across the Atlantic, saving countless lives. Across the Arctic, Russian civilians received vital food shipments, a lifeline in a brutal winter. Each crate, each ton of steel and cargo represented not just industry, but hope, the promise that the Allies could endure and prevail. The emotional impact was profound. Millions of lives depended on these ships, and the crews who sailed them carried the responsibility with steadfast resolve. Every sailor knew that a Liberty ship could mean the difference between victory and failure, between life and death. And as the war progressed, the Liberty fleet became an invisible backbone of strategy, supporting operations that culminated in the most ambitious Allied invasion in history, D-Day. Without these ships, the massive movement of troops, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel would have been impossible. By the time the fleet reached its peak, the historical significance was clear. The ugly ducklings of American shipyards had become indispensable instruments of war. They were more than cargo carriers. They were symbols of innovation, resilience, and collective effort. They proved that speed and efficiency, when guided by vision and human courage, could overcome doubt, ridicule, and danger. Looking back, it is difficult to overstate the fleet's importance. These ships, once dismissed as crude and hastily built, became lifelines across the Atlantic, Arctic, and Mediterranean theaters. The sailors, the engineers, the women in the shipyards, and the soldiers and civilians who relied on them together, they wove a story of determination and survival that would echo through history. The Liberty fleet had transformed from a mocked experiment into a cornerstone of Allied victory, and the world began to recognize the truth. Sometimes the most unassuming creations carry the greatest weight. And in the case of the Liberty ships, that weight was the fate of nations. The story of the Liberty ships did not end with the last convoy. Long after the war's fiercest battles had subsided, the legacy of these once mocked vessels continued to ripple across history. Henry Kaiser's vision, dismissed by skeptics, derided by engineers, and questioned by the military, had become an industrial miracle. He had turned the impossible into reality, demonstrating that innovation, efficiency, and audacity could reshape the very fabric of war. The shipyards that once seemed chaotic were now celebrated as engines of victory, their assembly lines producing not just steel and engines, but hope itself. The impact of the Liberty ships was profound. They turned the tide in the Atlantic, countering the relentless U-boat threat and keeping critical supply lines open to Britain and the Soviet Union. They enabled the logistics behind D-Day, delivering men, tanks, and supplies that made the largest amphibious invasion in history possible. Millions of lives depended on these ships, and countless soldiers and civilians survived because of their reliability. What had begun as a crude, ugly experiment had evolved into the backbone of Allied strategy, a testament to the power of human ingenuity under pressure. Looking back, it is almost impossible to reconcile the initial ridicule with the final recognition. The same engineers who once predicted disaster now spoke in awe of the ship's endurance. Journalists who had mocked their boxy frames now chronicled their heroic contributions. Even the sailors who had boarded them with trepidation grew to respect the vessels that had carried them through storms, attacks, and the unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic. The transformation was remarkable. The ugly ducklings of Portland and Richmond had become heroes in their own right. The story of the Liberty ships is, at its core, a story about people, the visionaries, the laborers, and the sailors who refused to let doubt dictate their actions. It is about courage and determination, about risking ridicule to achieve something extraordinary. It is about the idea that underdogs, those dismissed as inadequate or unworthy, can rise to become indispensable. In the face of skepticism, the Liberty ships persevered, proving that even the most unlikely creations can change the course of history. As the war ended and the Liberty fleet gradually retired from active duty, their legacy endured. They remained symbols of innovation, industrial might, and the human spirit's resilience. They reminded the world that progress often comes from bold experimentation, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary feats when united by a common purpose, and that sometimes the unassuming, overlooked, or ugly can carry the weight of nations on their shoulders. The ugly duckling had flown, not with grace or elegance, but with steadfast determination, endurance, and courage. And in doing so, it had earned a place in history, a monument to human ingenuity, bravery, and the belief that even the most improbable heroes can emerge when the world demands it most.